I'm James Callicutt, Waterfowl and Upland Gamebird Extension Specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, Assistant Professor of Upland Birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, Professor, Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Gamebird University. All right. Well, we've got another Delta waterfowl guest with us today. We recently had Matt Chenard on. Now we have Dr. Frank Rohwer, who's the president and chief scientist for Delta Waterfowl. Mark and I've known Frank for many years, kind of different capacities, but Frank, we're really excited to have you on. We know it's going to be a good conversation, so thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Frank, you spent most of your career in Louisiana State University before?
Yeah, I did. I was faculty at University of Maryland for a while, and then LSU for 21 years, and then I kind of gave up on the academic side and moved to Delta as a full-time employee. The entire time I was at LSU, I was down there actually signing my contract as an assistant professor and was contacted by Delta about being the scientific director. I've run the Delta science programs mostly since 1990. There were a couple of years where I tried to get out. They hired somebody and they didn't last too long. They had really smart people that just couldn't deal with all the weirdness of Delta at the time.
I hear you.
I want to ask you what weirdness there is at Delta.
Well, you had the misfortune of having to know Mark at that time. I'm sure he was even worse as a cocky 18-year-old something kid.
Yeah.
I was a very enjoyable undergrad from what I
He had confidence, I'll give him that. He believed it was destined to great things.
Yeah, that's right. If you say
Mike Chamberlain told me my senior year, Frank, he never met a bigger smartass than me in his life. And I
Coming
took that
from
as
Mike Chamberlain,
yeah, that's pretty something. I guess it just goes to show, if you say something stupid with a lot of confidence, it's got to be true.
I've relied on that to get me where I am.
Frank, can tell you.
Yeah, so I guess starting off with, Mark and I have been having a lot of conversations recently about, we talk about duck hunting a whole lot and then intermix science into it as we're having our coffee every workday morning. And, we'll talk about how, mild our weather is at certain times of the season and that sort of thing. And just as much as deer hunters talk about, the bucks and deer don't move during these hot times of the day, we kind of started talking about that with ducks and thought it'd be a cool conversation to talk about a little bit about what we know or don't know about, how those local weather can impact those daily movements or amount of foraging events and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Frank, you hunt down here a fair amount. I mean, I know when you do donor visits and stuff, you hunted in the South enough.
Oh yeah.
To be out there on a 70-degree day. Walk us through what we know about that, how it affects a mallard in particular or any other duck, and then how that affects management or hunters.
Yeah, it's surprising the good quality science that I'd like to be able to cite when we're talking about these things it's not abundant. It's in fact remarkably sparse. We know ducks move in response to weather, and so now you could talk about big scale movements. Like last year was, I think, pretty well a poor season across an awful lot of the South. Got a few good cold spells in January and some pushes of ducks, and for most of the season we heard really bad stuff. Well, that's because it was ridiculously warm. I like planting flowers, and I still had flowers blooming in October. That they die on the first frost. That should happen at the end of August or early September. Just strange weather will push ducks, but that's also true for local movements. Ducks respond to cold weather. When it gets bitter cold, sometimes they do something counterintuitive. They stop feeding twice a day and go to once a day. But when it's just moderately cold, as opposed to 70 degrees, at 70 degrees, a duck is going to need very little energy to get through the day. Hell, half the time they can get that from where they're actually refuging, on a refuge or something. So they don't even leave. So I've often thought we need to do a study where, the traditional way we do this is hang radios on ducks and monitor individual ducks. And that's been done a fair amount. And it's been done a lot more recently as we get these new GSM, GPS transmitters. But the other way to do this would be just look at duck harvest and know that hunters are really good at shooting juveniles and not very good at shooting adults. Most adult mallards are smarter than I am. And so the only time I can get them is when they're desperate, and that's cold weather days. And so we ought to just look at weather days and what gets harvested based on the wing beat. That's a data set of millions of wings now. And that would be a really good analysis. Remarkably enough, never been done. That's craziness. So we don't use these big data sets as much as we should. But what little transmitter work has been done clearly shows ducks move a lot more in colder weather than warm weather.
So I got to follow up on that. So like with quail, we know that they, and I'll do everything I can to shift this to galliforms throughout the episode. But
Sure.
with quail, they enter thermal stress at about 86-ish degrees Fahrenheit. Now that's just where they're going to gool or flutter. They're going to pan.
Yeah.
They're not dying. They're just in thermal stress. What is that for ducks?
I don't know, honestly. I honestly don't know that, Mark. Yeah.
Man. So, because like with quail, what's interesting is down here, they're in thermal stress the overwhelming majority of the summer.
Yeah.
And then cover so they can get cooler seems to be really important. But I never think about that with ducks down here. Like if it's, I know we had some high 70-degree days early in the duck season. So do we even know if they shift behavioral spatial patterns, like how they move to find cooler environments, or is it not even that hot for them?
I have to believe that heat isn't a problem for ducks. They're typically in the water and they have no trouble with, evaporating water. But I've been surprised, and Lord knows it's been a bunch of years since I've looked at physiological ecology data, even though, James King would roll over in his grave since, he was effectively, him and Charlie Robbins were my advisors for my master's. But the thermoneutral zone for ducks, the upper part, don't worry about it. They're not in heat stress. But I was amazed at how it's not very cold before they're expending energy. And that's a little surprising given, ducks and geese have pretty phenomenal insulation. And yet I'm not going to cite a number here because that's one where I'd just be way off. But I thought it'd be, getting close to freezing. And it's not. And so a little bit of cold weather. Doesn't take that much cold weather before ducks are having to expend energy to keep warm. And then that means they obviously need to feed more. So yeah.
And I wonder if it wouldn't be on that end, too, that you would see, like what you're saying, Mark, thinking about habitat use associated with, thermal regulation, getting some kind of thermal cover, whether it's getting in something thick, get out of the wind, and has a foraging source to build that energy, too, at the same time.
Yep.
And my guess is it's somewhat confounded as you get later in the season because, y'all, correct me if I'm wrong, as they're leaning more towards maybe forested wetlands for courtship and pairing type stuff, that would also be timing would be correlated with the colder decrease in temperatures.
Right.
So separating out what's doing what may not.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's driving that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeez. Y'all picked a hell of a critter to study, man. Jeez.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact
But we
that
wanted to study something more complicated than a bobwhite,
Yeah. The whole business of that long distance movement makes life a whole lot more complicated, and everything you do, from population studies to thermoregulatory studies to, what drives movement, because half your animals are gone.
So, Callicutt, let's switch the order here since we were going to come back to your stuff later, but you've got some ducks on air right now.
Yeah.
You're banded down here, and you're going to have more. And last I checked, y'all were getting locations every 15 minutes, something like that?
Well, probably every
when
hour.
they're here. Once they're here.
Oh, when they're here? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
About at least every hour, maybe. We can set it as, depending on the question that we're trying to get at. You can set it down.
Apparently, Frank, it's gotten a lot easier to change the duty cycle on these things than it was.
The business of being able to modify all this from your computer, and you never go in the field, and you've probably never tried to tune a null peak system, and then it just blows my mind how accurate this stuff is. So it's really amazing.
I'll definitely take it over riding around in that telemetry truck.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So once they're here, let's say because y'all are going to ban some Callicutt early season, right?
Yeah, so we're going to try to get some the early migrants that we tend to get in October, early November. Try to get some in that group, and
that's always tricky.
That's going to be an interesting trapping season. We'll see how successful it is, but we're going to try. Dang it!
It's always easy to make these grand plans from your office, and then when you're actually out there trying to catch ducks, and it takes you forever. Mark and I know about that from the ringneck work.
Yeah.
We set a lot of blinds watching ringnecks not feed on corn because they were.
Well, they were feeding on corn, but when a guy floods 200 bushel per acre corn, and we're putting out a 50-pound bag.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a bad combo.
Yeah,
Sometimes
for
you need an
sure.
airboat and a dip net to really get a
Yeah.
sample there.
Yeah. I have a feeling it is going to be very difficult. We just kind of piloted it this year, Frank. We only put out like about 18 transmitters, and we banded a fair amount of birds, 400 and something birds that we banded of all various species, whatever we call it. But right after the season closed, we had like a week of a week or two of pretty good trapping, catching stuff, and then we just got a ton of rain that we typically wouldn't get, because usually we're in that everybody's pulling their boards, the water's leaving the landscape, and ducks are packed in on what habitat's left. But then suddenly, like, every bayou was like flooded out in the delta, and they were all in that just fresh sheet water out there. And when we would get mallards and traps is the most frustrating I've ever dealt with as in the field. And is that we'd have the camera, and again, with the technology, we had the little motion cameras or whatever that send us the pictures to our phones. Got a picture of the trap. There's probably like 80 gadwall and no telling how many wood ducks in it, and there's like 12 mallards way back in the back of this trap. Between the time of leaving the shop to there, they had apparently parted the sea of gadwall and swam out. All those others in there still, all those gadwalls still in there. Those mallards just made their way out. I think we had like 2 still in there out of like the nearest. So they're frustrating one way or the other. So, but probably just catching anything in that early season is going to be difficult.
Yeah.
So, but you'll have them, and then going back to what we're talking about, like if you increase your frequency of point collection, I'm trying to figure out the best way to determine like how. And of course, you can always go back and pull ambient temperature, but what are we thinking? Like on a 65, 70 degree day or 80 degree day, geez, in October, Mississippi, 85 degree day. They're hardly feeding at all, I guess. And then as soon, let's say cold front comes in first week in November, you should see not only an increase in movement or an increase to high quality foraging. Is that what you'd expect? And then they wouldn't be maybe they'd just be loafing, for lack of a better word. I don't know what y'all call it with ducks when they're just hanging out. Is that what you'd expect?
That's what I would expect.
That's what I would expect. Yeah.
That'd be pretty cool to see, because like if I'm a duck hunters, I'll give the MSU Deer Lab a lot of credit. They answer questions that deer hunters really care about. They really put this moon phase thing to bed and everything like that with just massive amounts of telemetry. And does it have a real management implication? No, but deer hunters care about it and they subscribe to everything and it works. I think like if as intuitive as it may be to a duck hunter in the South, just showing it and say, hey man, like your duck, it sucks today.
Yeah.
But it's not your fault.
Yeah, and I've thought about that a lot with, of course, given my extension appointment. I have the little bit more flexibility to probably spend more time answering some questions beyond what the, pure more management-driven portion of the research is. So I've thought there's tons of those, that we could get at, whether it's, and then some things that we tell folks, and we just never really have a whole lot of data out there, like the board pulling effect. Like people, I don't know how many landowners tell me in February that the ducks just showed up, and we need to go into February with hunting season, and it's, if I can show this how much through remote sensing or whatever, this is how much wetland cover is out there, and then immediately after the season, it's not there anymore, and then all these birds went from being spread across a landscape to being sandwiched into what's left on the landscape. Just little things like that can help us better inform people about what's going on.
Well, I think in the duck movement and habitat use, I mean, there's so many folks in the South that are convinced that refuges are screwing them because they're holding all the ducks, and they don't take a regional look and say, without this refuge holding 50,000 ducks, you wouldn't have, the spillover that hits you on good cold days or when the wind's blowing. And I think showing that sort of stuff. So we've seen a lot of folks in the South get really excited about knowing what ducks are doing, because it's frustrating when you're sitting there and you're not seeing anything, and to know what's happening, I think is beneficial to duck hunters.
I think so too.
That's one of the cool things about Delta is we never lose track of the fact that we're driven by duck hunters, and we're the Duck Hunters organization, and so we really care about producing more ducks for duck hunters and telling duck hunters about what the heck is impacting their hunting season.
Yeah, and then just to play devil's advocate, the people that the flip side of this would say, well, if you show that ducks aren't moving, are people going to hunt less, right? Yeah. And are less days of field. Yeah. And Callicutt, you and I got in a conversation with some other duck researchers not too long ago about this, and coming down to why people are going out. And, the Callicutt are a good example of, if we were going out purely just to shoot ducks, we probably limit to much fewer days. We like going to the duck camp. We like going out. We like getting out there. We sat there, I'm afraid to say how many days, and not pulled the trigger and had a really good time.
Yeah.
But if people start going less because the Callicutt tells them ducks aren't moving today, for just to overly simplify it, is that a bad thing necessarily, as long as they're buying a license?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's a fun social science question.
Yeah. You're getting dangerously close to what it is that satisfies a duck hunter. And
Yes.
we've been trying to answer that question for 40 years. And frankly, we've done a terrible job at it.
Yeah.
And partly it's because we keep asking simple questions and hunters are sort of second guessing what the answer should be instead of just. So it's a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of those conversations about waterfowl surveys and waterfowl hunter surveys and human dimensions and how you word questions and that type of research and social science and I always used to say, because we would remember when I was on the flyway tech section, we'd start talking about the price of the duck stamp, and they're like, folks in Arkansas say they'll quit duck hunting if they did. Like, they know why you're asking that question. A willingness to pay question is a stupid question. They know if you say yes, they're going to increase the cost of the duck stamp.
And meanwhile, a duck stamp costs a quarter of what it takes to fill your tank with gas. And and meanwhile, they have a $3,000 duck lease, and $10 increase in the duck stamp's going to
the cheapest part of your input. And they're like, nope, I can't. That's too much. Can't do it.
Completely agree with you. Yeah.
Totally, Callicutt, you and I have talked about this a lot. I totally avoided human dimensions type classes as an undergrad. I thought it was the biggest bunch of witchcraft nonsense ever. And then, unfortunately, I've had to get rather into it. I published 3 or 4 papers using survey data. And you're right. There's a huge assumption about the honesty and the motivation of them answering the question. But even more challenging, I think, let's assume everything the social science literature tells us is reliable, which, there's some caveats there. All it tells us, for the most part, is either what motivates them or what they're willing to do or not do. It doesn't say a word about what we as the biologists, what we're supposed to do with that information in terms of messaging. It doesn't tell us how. We have no marketing skills, and we're sure as hell not taking those classes. So let's say it told us landowners are motivated by this, whatever, or hunters. No one's telling us what to do with that information, even if we could 100% rely on it. So it's a real challenge, that whole social science, human dimension side. We don't know what to do with that information. In the quail world with private landowners, we've asked a million types of questions. People have published papers like crazy. And then it's like, well, great. Now what? And we don't really have an answer for them. So when I was at UGA, did some ringneck research with Delta, which was a lot of fun, with Tori Mezevich, who, by the way, did you virtually attend her dissertation defense?
I did not.
Slacker. I totally did for about 10 minutes. I love
Tori. She's a great student. Yeah, I thought that was really fun research. And this is a classic Delta thing. We had a major donor who was very interested in his ducks and where they went. And we started this research, and frankly, I was not excited about it. But then when we, had a good sample size and put on a bunch of transmitters, we really found out something pretty interesting about ringnecks. And ringnecks, I think, are just, I've never been a big diving duck hunter. I don't think canvasbacks are the king of ducks, and I'd rather eat a green-winged teal or bluewing any day than a canvasback. But they are regal and cool ducks. But ringnecks are, they're a top 10 duck in every single flyway. And they're a really important duck in the Atlantic flyway. And in fact, the Atlantic flyway, diverged from having mallards be their AHM, species that set their seasons, partly because mallards were declining. They said, well, look, let's make a 4-species model, and ringnecks are the second most important species in that model. And yet they had virtually no data on ringnecks. And they had assumed that those ringnecks come from the east. And then we put a bunch of transmitters on birds in Florida and Georgia and find out that the vast majority of those birds are coming out of the western boreal forest. And that was really very cool. I think that was a big surprise. And if you look at ringneck populations, the 2 duck populations that nobody knows anything about are ringnecks, well, they're not in the survey because they only put the data for the 10 most commonly shot species back in 1955. And God knows the service could never change. Now add a few more species. Lord knows the service. But anyway, ringnecks have gone from virtually, a species way below 500,000 ducks to, they're 3 million ducks now. And the vast majority of that increase has been in the western boreal. Hell, they've replaced lesser scaup in many of the transect lines as the most important duck. And that's really cool. And yet the Atlantic Flyway is basing their regulations on only eastern ringnecks, which have remained remarkably stable. So, that was really cool information.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, because I was just looking at that map the other day, because I used some of Tori's data in a GIS class I teach. I send it all to them in a CSV file and I make them build the winter home range maps in ArcGIS, and we were looking at it, and then I was perusing through some of the migration. The migration data. And correct me if I'm wrong, Frank. And over those 2 years, it was just one, if not two, that wintered in South Georgia that actually went back up into the Atlantic.
Yeah,
for
right.
breeding, right? Everything else just fanned out across the U.S. and ended up. I think we had one nest in the southern extent of the Arctic Circle, and it was just this crazy spaghetti map of ringnecks everywhere.
And they go pretty far north. I mean, there are quite a few ringnecks breeding in Minnesota, but we never had any in the early years. And I remember for the donor, I had to go and find one of his ducks on the breeding ground. And he, of course, thought that my ringnecks, because they're in this group of 40,000 ringnecks, they're all going to go to one spot, and he's going to send us there and figure out how to make way more. And I told him, it's not going to work that way. They're going to spread out. And so, I spent 3 days, drove to the paw, that's a drive, 1 day drive, and then rented an airplane and flew 3 hours out the Saskatchewan River Delta to find this one duck. It seemed that, any study of ringnecks up, even in this spot where it's reasonably accessible, would be $1 million studies. So,
because they were in every province, I think.
Oh, yeah, right.
Tori tried to do like a cluster analysis, and you couldn't because they were all
spread out.
Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Nunavut, you name it, Northwest Territories. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So what are y'all doing now on the run? Are y'all still doing stuff? I know y'all expanded up the East Coast a little bit. Are y'all still doing ringneck work?
We did, because we wanted to know, okay, what happens to ringnecks from that are wintering in South Carolina or Maryland, and those birds that are farther up the flyway, and when we caught them, they're going east. So they were splitting 50-50 east and west, and so that was pretty cool. We didn't get a huge sample there, but we had about 40 or 50, so it wasn't terrible.
Yeah. Well, ringnecks are definitely. I'm kind of like you, Frank. I haven't been just a huge diver fan, other than when we were all poor in grad school and too busy with field work to find good spots to duck hunt. We hunted scaup on catfish ponds, but ringnecks are always been, because they're kind of like a pelagic dabbler, because even their diet and stuff's kind of more akin to a gadwall than
for sure.
I can
eat
tell
a lot
you
of
this,
corn.
in a duck blind, the mallards are great, blah blah blah. But the sound of a flock of ringnecks is a whole different experience. And Frank, the first time down on that study in South Georgia, the first time Tori and I sat in one of those duck blinds and we're trying to just kind of get an idea of what was going on, I still have that video on my phone. Yeah. And I've never I've hunted the prairies. I've never seen that many ducks enter an area so small so quickly, and it was absolutely phenomenal.
James, we were having a hard time catching ducks, and so we thought, okay, we got them. We're going to put mist nets up on floating platforms. And it took us, 2 or 3 days to build these damn things. And then we go out there at 2 a.m. and we got mist nets tangled, and it was like, but we got these mist nets strung up. And frankly, I was a little worried that we had 5 mist nets in a row. And I thought, these ringnecks are going to come in and we're going to catch 150, and they're going to take the net down. We're going to kill them and drown them. And we caught one female ringneck. They can fly more or less like wood ducks. They'd be flying low, and they'd see that net and just go up and over. Oh my God!
Turns out they could see the very sheer mist net a lot better than we thought. It was
So we had 40,000 ringnecks land on this these impoundments. We got one. Not a great ratio.
Well, I'm glad that y'all finally figured that out. But I would have thought you would have. I would be along the lines with you, Frank, and feel like that'd be a bit of a cluster for sure. But Would have thought you'd have caught more than one.
It was inches away from success. Just not enough. They would see it and literally just land right behind it. It was, and we tried our best to camouflage the platforms. And Frank acts like, Frank loves building shit, so he had a ball for 3 days while we were trying to, in a warehouse in South Georgia, while we're trying to figure out how to do this. And, but yeah, it was. I assume those platforms are probably still down there.
I'm sure Wyatt's burned them by now.
Sure.
This totally a different topic here, but it just popped in my head because I meant to ask Chenard this the last time with the hen houses. I had a student stop by the other day and was asking me this question and asking about hen houses, say in Louisiana or Texas or anywhere Gulf Coast in mottled duck range. Would mottled ducks utilize hen houses?
Yeah, when I look at mottled ducks, I'm always amazed that they even exist, because virtually all the studies show just this terrible nest success. And, from Stutzenbaker's work around, and the only place we've seen glimpses of real success are in these short-term islands created at the Chavalier Mississippi Delta. And so I was very excited. And given that, their genetics says they're just a wee bit different from mallards, as are black ducks, I thought, okay, hen houses are going to work. And we tried them. And we've tried them all over. And we have had a great big goose egg. We have never had a mottled duck or a black duck nest in a hen house. And that's pretty amazing when you think how closely related they are to mallards.
Yeah.
And mallards are, there's a reason mallards are the most abundant duck. They're just so darn adaptable. And the same thing, here in I started working at Delta in 75, and part of that was working for Mike Anderson and working over in diving duck country at Minnedosa, overwater nest searching. And we had very few mallards overwater nesting. And now, in the Minnedosa area, where nest success has been chronically 4% for mallards, they nest over water, and they do way better. They're approaching canvasback sort of nest success around 20%. Well, for mallard, 20% is above break even. So it's been remarkable that at Minnedosa, where you have this incredible wetland density, the mallards that are successful are nesting in hen houses or over water. But it's a shame that mottled ducks don't use them, because it'd be a really effective strategy to try and save mottled ducks.
Well, for sure.
Frank, what is the break even on nest success for mallards? You said it's around 20.
The most recent stuff, we used to use 15%, and the assessment is the best study, and it says 13.7 or 8. So, and we don't actually know with the same level of detail, but we assume pretty much for everything else we're at 20%, just because mallards are the king of renesting. I mean, they make everything else look pathetic. Blue wings, I don't think we've actually measured renesting rates right, because the studies have always used backpack transmitters. And we know, what's funny is on the breeding grounds, nobody would touch a backpack transmitter on a dabbling duck, knowing that you have completely altered breeding behavior. And so this incredible resurgence of, God, there are millions and millions of dollars of transmitters going out in the Atlantic Flyway, Mississippi Flyway, Central Flyway on mallards. And, it's because of frankly, these GSM, GPS transmitters are like cocaine to duck biologists. It's just too easy and attractive. You can program it. You can get 15 locations a day or 4 or 5 and solar recharge. And we all quit worrying about backpacks. And we know backpacks are having a significant survival effect. Nobody publishes how many of their radios are still working in a year. And if you did, you'd find out, only 10% of mallards live a year. Like, oh yeah, no, that's not quite right. 10% of mallards with a backpack.
So is abdominal inserts the way to go, or what's the way to go?
It seems insane, doesn't it? Take a duck, anesthetize it, cut it open, puff a radio in, put a hole through its back, thread an antenna out, sew it up, and that is way better for a duck than anything else. That just makes no sense at all. But
well, I think the challenge for a lot of people is, And we would have been in this situation had we not had that relationship with the USGS vet, is getting a vet that is willing and able to do it.
Right.
Because a lot of them haven't done it. And it's expensive. A lot of people these vets are charging a huge chunk.
Yeah, there are some vets that are making quite a lot of money by being a traveling vet. And we frankly have had good luck because we found a university professor that would trade, authorship for spending 2 weeks at a site to do something. And I'd love to. We have a donor. Same donor that funded the ringneck work really wants us to do whistling ducks, and we so need to do whistling ducks in the south and figure out, what's their movement pattern. We're not getting any harvest on them because they move out and then they congregate at safe areas, and we'd like to know what fraction of them are breeding in boxes and a whole variety of questions. And you need transmitters. Well, okay, I was willing to say, okay, well, we could put a backpack on. Well, you can't do that with a whole nesting duck, so
No, yeah.
we'd love to do implant transmitters, but that's expensive, and transmitters are messy. Always have been.
I think we were having that conversation towards the end of duck season. There were several of us got together and kind of hunted that last weekend this season. That was one of the comments. We were talking about black bellies and transmitter issues. Can't put a backpack on them because they can't, messes with them getting into the cavity or the box, and any number of things. And then, of course, the conversation took the turn towards just and it's still something I think about all the time, like what ecological release happened for these birds to totally shift in the last, 20 years into where they are now. Because I remember when we were in grad school, Mark, if we saw one, it was like the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
And then now they're like flying over my neighborhood every day when I'm going for a walk or something, They're here all spring and summer.
Do we know what the ecological release was, or that's still, we don't know yet?
I don't know that we know
I don't
yet.
even have a good hypothesis.
I don't either.
That's what's frightening. The release of snow geese, I got a good hypothesis there, but whistling ducks, it's not like they all of a sudden figured out that they can eat grain in the winter, nothing obvious, that's for sure, but they sure have expanded.
I don't think any of us had a clue. Me and Davis and Askren and Jared Henson and Drew Fowler and a bunch of us, we were just like, no, none of us have an idea of what that is.
Yeah, they are everywhere now. God, I think Christine Evans told me, our faculty next door to me, she told me there was one like in the parking lot of her kid's school last year, like just walking around. So
and the breeding records are insane. They're starting to show up way up north.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. They used to be when they were nesting in Memphis. It was a big deal. That's old hat. Now they're in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah, I remember one that many years ago when they weren't even really coming much north of, Memphis, like you said. I remember being somewhere up in northern Arkansas and seeing one. I was on the way to, it was when I was working for DU, and I was going to some educational event or something. I was putting on a program, and Doug Osborne happened to come to it. He had his daughter with him, and he as soon as he walked up to me, he said, "Did you see that whistling duck off the highway?" It was like a big thing. He was just sitting in like this little, puddle in between in the middle of the 4-lane, right there in the median. It was the first one I'd seen that far north at that time. Now they're all over the place.
Yeah.
Frank, what other research has Delta got going on? I know y'all typically have stuff all over the place. Anything cool?
Yeah. We've spent a lot of time in the last few years advancing drones.
I saw a bunch of Kevin's work.
Yeah, drones are really effective for a variety of things. We just did a cool study last year. I think it's going to be in print soon. That drones are the way to count pairs. And what's kind of cool is you don't have to go very far back. Jake Bushaw started some drone work for us, and he couldn't count pairs. Well, the technology is advancing so much that we now have good visual cameras, and we're not flying the drone so low that we flush birds. So counting pairs, but the real advance is the brood work.
Yeah.
The service quit doing brood surveys because they were useless. What good is a survey when you're counting brown ducks from moving airplane? Well, now we can do really good brood counts. So we're getting 60%.
With thermal?
Yeah, with thermal, as opposed to the best you could do with double observers was around 20%. Well, that's useless. But at 68%, I'd love to get away from, James, you spent a lot of time net searching, I'm sure. We'd love to get away from that. Let's go out and count pairs in the beginning of the season and then evaluate what management, whatever we're trying to improve duck production. Let's count broods at the end of the season and say, oh yeah, where we trap, We get a lot more broods. Measuring brood survival without transmitters, just by putting a nasal saddle on, and then found out we're able to find 60% of those females. And now you can mark a whole bunch of females with a nasal disc and then go out and they're individually identified and know what fraction of their ducklings survives.
Yeah. So even amongst all the vegetation, you can still detect them pretty well?
It's amazing how thick the vegetation can be, and you still get that thermal signature. And then you flip to a visual camera and you identify it and can age the ducklings. So we also, there's a company out of Australia that figured out that, VHF radios are cheap, $200 a piece, relative to almost 10 times that for a good GPS transmitter. And we can put VHF transmitters on, a little prong and suture thing that has minimal effects and fly a drone with a Yagi on it, and it's really good at finding these marked birds. So that's been exciting.
Are they actually be able to get a precise location, or they're just confirming they're alive?
No, super precise. I would argue way better than the best we could ever do with null peak systems and triangulations, even with 3 or 4 locations. So super accurate. Tell you what part of the wetland it's on.
Interesting.
Nice.
Yeah.
There's been we've been tinkering around that with quail with VHF. Now, granted, that was in a pine forest, like down in South Georgia.
Yeah.
And we didn't have they're, again, developing technology.
Yeah.
But we didn't have near the success with just a little attempt we made with the precision of it. Again, you got a whole lot of trees there. And then on the thermal, so you have to go a little higher. And then on the thermal side, we published a paper with quail trying to count coveys with a thermal camera and published it in Conservation Science and Practice or something like Ecology and Evolution. I can't remember. And it worked, but the way we did it, it wasn't actually, it wasn't perfectly designed, but it wasn't all that much better than auditory covey counts.
Oh, yeah.
Because, and granted, this was several years ago, the technology's changed rapidly, evolving, like you said. If they were under anything that
couldn't pick
it
them up.
just... You could tell something was there.
Yeah.
It was like it didn't give off that ring formation. So we want to go back and do that because the technology seems to be changing every 2.5 years.
Yeah. It's really remarkable. We still have been had a complete failure on finding dabbling duck nests. And what's interesting is the first time we ever used a drone, we contracted with a drone, and it found virtually all of the marked nests I had in a field. Well, we hit the one perfect day. And since then, we've tried to find dabbling duck nests. And you basically have 45 minutes or an hour where you can do it right at dawn. And then after that, every damn ant mound rock goes. And so you get all these false positives, and it's just not useful. So we're still using ATVs and chains to find duck nests.
It's amazing how ant beds light up on the thermal.
Yeah.
We saw the same thing. We're like, is that a covey? And then we're like, oh, no, it's just because there can't be that many coveys this close together because we got fire ant mounds everywhere. Yeah. And it was, but like the same thing with us. The first person we contracted with a guy 19, and the data ended up almost being completely useless. Like you couldn't see anything. And then just a few years later, the technology had advanced, the thermal camera and the quality of the image had advanced so much. It was with one bird marked. Like we caught several extra birds out of a covey. We just walked out there with a cast net, like the covey, the one bird mark and then you see on the drone at 100 feet, there's the covey, and we just walked out with a cast net and set it down over them and caught 4 or 5 more individuals in the covey. But again, now I'm sure the technologies and the affordability of these high-res thermal cameras is just insane.
Yeah. For diving duck nests, that used to be just terrible work. You'd put on your waders and wade through cattails. And, 3 nests a day was a big day, a good day, And so once in a while you'd have 5 or 6. The other day the boys in Mendoza found 54 canvasback nests in one day. That's a new world record. Now they've just surpassed it in recent days. But the drones are really good at finding canvasback nests just because the cold water and the heat signature and way faster. So
going back to your dabblers, even at night when the ambient temperature would be a higher distance away from the nest, you still can't.
We still haven't been very successful with either ducks or pheasants. Yeah, so we need to try again now because, as you say, the technology's gotten better. So the drone work, that's sort of one of the more exciting things we're doing. We're still, people are sick of Delta showing that predator management works. We've published, a bunch of papers on that, but basically we're still doing that sort of work to figure out how to increase return on investment. And that's been really fun work, to say, with hotspot trapping, we get 1,000 more ducks out of a trapping contract. And so, we lowered the cost. We have this million duck program where we're going to raise 1 million ducks a year. And originally it was costing us 15 million. Well, now it's way below that because we figured out more efficient ways to do trapping and what's brood survival. And so, for your average duck hunter, that's, I think, some of the most exciting work we're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting is you're seeing a lot more focus in all aspects of our profession. It just seems like maybe in the last 7, maybe 8 years, this re-emphasis, or maybe the first time in my career, this really intense focus on ROI to whatever it is you're doing, like with, we've done the same thing with James Martin published the same stuff with quail predator trapping. And so, right. What is this costing? What is supplemental feed costing us? What are these things doing? And I think it's a good question because if we want the public or whoever our constituents are to engage and especially under the new challenges to federal funding, where private donor funding is probably going to play more of a role over the next several years, showing that ROI, I think, is a useful strategy to just make it efficient.
The old Locomone, there's an old paper by Locomone and others that talked about cost efficiency, and it was virtually ignored for decades and decades. And us waterfowl biologists, we're still doing some things that I think are amazing. We still have this hope that if we plant enough grass, we'll make nests a needle in a haystack. And we've got 50 years of data showing that doesn't work, and yet we're still spending millions of dollars on it. And it's a little frustrating that we don't look at cost efficiency at management.
Well, the other thing that's really challenging, I know in the quail world, now that everyone's so much more focused on like ecosystem services, and the new arms race seems to be the way to economically quantify the value of, the carbon's the really popular example now. If we plant native grass, how much carbon do we sequester, and what's the monetary value of that service being provided? But I gave a talk at a conference a couple years ago, and I mentioned that wildlife are the unaccounted for ecosystem service that everybody forgets. Like the value of a duck, or the value of a pheasant, or the value of a quail. Like we don't do a really good job, or at least the ecosystem services folks haven't done a really good job. And I'm not criticizing them. I don't even know how to do it either. Of saying, look, the cultural value of this thing being in this landscape, it wouldn't be static. It would vary dramatically. Quail's probably going to be a lot more valuable in Texas than it is in Mississippi. But there's this whole discussion. There's journals, ecosystem service journals, and wildlife populations. Just the fact that they're there and abundant, just do not get enough credit.
Yeah,
like there's value in having this thing there, and there's value in having it at a level that you can harvest it. And I wish I knew how to do it, because I've worked with some ecosystem service econ guys, and they're brilliant. But they're speaking a whole different language than the people I'm talking to can understand.
I think that's really important, and it's in the duck world. You have to argue it's even more important. Look at California. Look at the Central Valley. This is a place that winters 25% of North America's ducks, and the fact that if it weren't for duck hunters, I don't know how much water would be left. And holy Christmas, where would the ibis and the rails and the shorebirds be if it weren't for duck hunters? And so,
but that's the thing. Even when you talk about it, they'll talk about they'll have a caveat in there for diversity.
Yeah.
It's like, well, okay, but these waterfowl populations or these quail populations are. I'll give hats off. You brought up pheasants. Hats off to the pheasant people. Yeah. They have done a much better job than the rest of us, at least in the states that are real destination pheasant states, to put a monetary value to the taxpayer on having good grasslands, having good pheasants, and and what that does to their local economy. Yeah. Best published a paper in 99 on the economic value of bobwhite hunting, and I don't think there's been anything close to it. Maybe outside of the Red Hills. I know they've done a great job of valuing everything there, but the rest of the range, we don't have a clue. So there's a lot of reasons to plant grass and plant other things to benefit a lot of things, but we're really good at quantifying the economic value of what it does to other stuff, and we don't do a really good job of quantifying what it does for the other critters, and it's just been frustrating. Callicutt, where we at on time?
We're at 50 minutes on time.
All right, Frank, the last comment's yours. What you got? Anything you want to part our listeners with?
Oh, wow. Open-ended. No, not really.
How'd your pheasant season go last year?
We had a really good pheasant season, and unfortunately, we had virtually no snow this winter, so bad forecast for ducks. Driving around this spring, I don't think I've ever seen so many pheasants. So pheasants have come through really well, and we'll have another great pheasant season.
I look forward to that invite, yeah.
Yeah.
You still hunting with your Springer?
Oh, yeah. That criminal dog, he's laying right over there. He's 11s. We both are a little bit slower, but he's still faster. I think by next year, I might be able to keep up with him in ERP, but he's a cattail dog.
Did you get a new dog yet?
Not yet. Hoping to get a new Springer sometime.
Okay, so that's your breed from now on? You're sticking with him?
Oh, yeah. He's a fabulous duck dog. I get invited now on some duck hunts only because I bring Daniel Spat. I'm just along for baggage.
Yeah, we've been talking about doing an episode. Was it Doug Spell we were going to have on cows?
Yeah, I can't remember who we were going to have on.
Somebody talk about just the importance of dogs.
Yeah.
In this profession, and of course there's conservation dogs, but at the end of the day, goodness gracious, what would these sports be like if we didn't have those things with us?
Oh yeah, I can't imagine hunting without a dog. So
yeah. And so we'll try to get Doug on. I think we had to reschedule, but talk about that. He's a big duck and upland hunter.
Yeah,
and really cool guy.
Yeah, I was actually going to say back to thinking about Piron. He's the reason I have a Gordon setter right now.
There you go. Yeah,
because I lived. Because of Bosco, that one he had. And so I was like, I'm going to have to get one of these one day. It only took, 20 years, but I finally got one. Kept having duck dogs in between, and then I finally was like, I'm going to have to get me an upland dog.
I remember in Baton Rouge, he was living with Thayer, and Bosco was there, and Piron didn't like for him to lick people, so he'd kind of stick his tongue out and then pull it back because he was taught not to lick people, so he'd be sitting there, his tongue would just be trying to come to him, but he could tell he was conflicted. That was that's the best Gordon I'd ever seen.
Bosco was a great dog. He was a ton of fun.
Well.
Yeah, gentlemen, well, that was a good conversation. We covered a lot of different topics, and Frank, it's been a long time since I've seen you. It was really good to have you back.
Yeah, good to catch up.
And I hate that you had to see Mark, but other than that,
Yeah.
All right.
Good. Well, it's been a lot of fun, guys. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, appreciate it, Frank.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on Gamebird University podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped or for more information on game birds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_Gamebird or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Gamebird Program.